The private jet's engines hummed to life on the tarmac of LaGuardia Airport, but Marcus Blackwood barely glanced up from his platinum MacBook Pro as his assistant Jennifer approached with yet another crystal tumbler of aged scotch. The amber liquid caught the afternoon light streaming through the aircraft's panoramic windows, casting golden reflections across the cream-colored leather interior that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus had grown accustomed to such luxuries over the past decade, ever since Blackwood Industries had catapulted him from an ambitious Stanford graduate into one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His fingers moved with practiced precision across the keyboard, finalizing the acquisition deal that would add another tech startup to his ever-expanding empire. The numbers on the screen represented more than just profit margins and market projections. They represented power, influence, and the kind of success that opened every door and silenced every critic who had once doubted a kid from the wrong side of Detroit could build something this magnificent. Marcus paused only to adjust the platinum cufflinks adorning his custom-tailored Tom Ford shirt, a subtle reminder of how far he had traveled from his humble beginnings. Beside him, stretched across the plush seating area like a cat basking in sunlight, lay Isabella Montenegro, a Venezuelan supermodel whose face had graced the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Elle more times than Marcus could count. Her long raven black hair cascaded over the ivory cashmere throw as she scrolled through her phone, occasionally letting out small sighs of satisfaction at the flood of likes and comments on her latest Instagram post from their weekend in the Hamptons. Isabella represented everything Marcus had convinced himself he wanted in a companion: breathtaking beauty, social status, and the kind of arm candy presence that made other powerful men envious at charity galas and board meetings. "Darling," Isabella purred in her sultry accent, not bothering to look up from her phone. "How much longer until we reach Aspen? I promised the photographer I'd be at the resort by sunset for the shoot." Her manicured fingers, adorned with a tennis bracelet worth more than most luxury cars, continued their rhythmic scrolling as she spoke. The diamond engagement ring Marcus had given her just 3 months prior caught the light with each movement, though he noticed she wore it more like an accessory than a symbol of commitment. Marcus glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a limited edition piece he'd acquired at auction for nearly $500,000. Captain Rodriguez said, "Wheels up in 15 minutes. We'll have you at the resort with time to spare for your precious photo session." His tone carried the subtle edge of irritation that had become increasingly common in their interactions. Isabella's world revolved around maintaining her image and social media presence, while Marcus found himself growing weary of conversations that never ventured deeper than surface-level concerns about lighting, angles, and brand partnerships. The intercom crackled to life, interrupting the ambient jazz music that had been playing softly in the background. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Captain Rodriguez. I'm afraid we've encountered an unexpected delay. The FAA has grounded all private aircraft. Due to severe weather conditions developing along our flight path, we're looking at a minimum 3-hour delay, possibly longer, depending on how quickly this storm system moves through." Isabella's perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed as she finally looked up from her phone. 3 hours? Marcus, you promised we wouldn't have these kinds of delays with a private jet. I have contractual obligations, and if I'm late, it could affect my relationship with the brand. Her voice carried the petulant tone of someone unaccustomed to having her schedule disrupted by forces beyond her control. Marcus closed his laptop, with more force than necessary, the sharp sound echoing through the cabin. "It's weather, Isabella. Even I can't control Mother Nature." He stood and straightened his jacket, his mind already calculating the ripple effects this delay would have on his own carefully orchestrated schedule. "We'll wait it out at the executive lounge. I need to make some calls anyway." As they disembarked from the private jet, Marcus couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between their luxurious aircraft and the commercial terminal they now had to navigate. The exclusive FBO lounge was comfortable enough, with its leather seating, complimentary champagne, and panoramic views of the runway, but it still felt like a step down from the rarefied air of private aviation he'd grown accustomed to. Isabella immediately claimed a corner table where the lighting was most flattering for her inevitable social media updates about their unexpected adventure. Marcus settled into a leather armchair with his phone, diving into a conference call with his acquisition team about the morning's negotiations. The familiar rhythm of business discussions, market analysis, competitive positioning, revenue projections provided a welcome distraction from Isabella's increasingly frequent complaints about the delay. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether their relationship was built on anything more substantial than mutual convenience and public image enhancement. The executive lounge began filling with other stranded passengers as the weather delay extended throughout the afternoon. Marcus observed the mix of business travelers, wealthy vacationers, and international jet-setters who comprised the typical clientele of such facilities. Most were absorbed in their own devices, making calls, sending emails, or scrolling through social media, each person existing in their own bubble of digital connectivity, despite being physically gathered in the same space. As the delay stretched into its fourth hour, even the executive lounge's amenities began to feel inadequate. The complimentary bar had run low on top-shelf liquor, the catered hors d'oeuvres had been picked over, and the Wi-Fi struggled under the increased load of frustrated travelers trying to manage their disrupted schedules. Isabella's mood had deteriorated proportionally with each passing hour, her complaints evolving from professional concerns to personal grievances about everything from the lounge's temperature to the quality of the sparkling water. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Isabella declared, her voice carrying across the lounge with enough volume to draw disapproving glances from other passengers. "We're paying premium prices for premium service, and this is what we get. I could have flown commercial and experienced the same delays." She gestured dramatically at her phone screen, which displayed a cascade of increasingly frantic messages from her team about the postponed photo shoot. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin, not just with the situation, but with Isabella's inability to handle adversity with any semblance of grace. "The weather affects everyone equally, Isabella. Getting upset about it won't make the storm pass any faster." His response was measured but cool, the kind of tone he typically reserved for underperforming employees or difficult business negotiations. The announcement came over the lounge's speaker system just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the runway. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that all private aircraft departures have been cancelled for the evening due to continued severe weather conditions. The earliest possible departure time will be tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., pending improved weather conditions. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause." Isabella's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor, her face flushed with indignation. "Cancelled?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "They can't just cancel our flight. Do they know who we are?" Her voice rose to a pitch that made several nearby passengers turn to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed annoyance. Marcus felt a familiar tightness In his chest, the kind of stress that came not from business challenges, which he thrived on, but from personal situations that seemed to spiral beyond his control. "Keep your voice down," he said firmly, standing to face her. "Making a scene won't change the weather forecast." "Don't tell me to keep my voice down," Isabella snapped, her accent becoming more pronounced as her emotions escalated. "You promised me this wouldn't happen with a private jet. You said we'd never have to deal with commercial airline problems. Well, guess what, Marcus? We're dealing with them now, and I'm the one who's going to suffer the professional consequences." The argument that followed was swift and brutal, playing out in the kind of public display that Marcus had spent years carefully avoiding. Isabella's frustration boiled over into personal attacks about his workaholic tendencies, his emotional unavailability, and his apparent inability to solve problems that couldn't be fixed with money or influence. Marcus found himself defending not just the weather delay, but their entire relationship, while simultaneously questioning why he was bothering to do so. "You know what, Isabella?" Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the cold finality that his business rivals had learned to fear. "Maybe this delay is exactly what we both needed, a moment of clarity." He pulled out his phone and began typing with sharp, decisive movements. "I'm having my driver take you back to the city. You can catch a commercial flight tomorrow morning. If you're that desperate to get to Aspen." Isabella's eyes widened with shock, then narrowed with fury. "You're abandoning me at an airport, after all we've been through together." She held up her left hand, the engagement ring catching the overhead lights like a weapon. "What about this? What about our engagement?" Marcus looked at the ring, then at Isabella's face, and felt something cold and empty settle in his chest. "What about it? When was the last time we talked about anything that mattered? When did we last have a conversation that wasn't about your career, my business, or our public image?" He paused, watching her expression shift from anger to something that might have been hurt, though he couldn't be sure. "Take the ring with you. Consider it compensation for the inconvenience." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she grabbed her designer purse and the small overnight bag she'd brought for their weekend getaway. "You'll regret this, Marcus. You'll realize what you've lost, and by then, it'll be too late." With that declaration, she strode out of the executive lounge, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor until the sound faded into the general noise of the terminal. Marcus stood alone in the suddenly quiet corner of the lounge, aware that their very public breakup had provided entertainment for the other stranded passengers. He could feel their eyes on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental, most simply curious about the personal drama that had unfolded before them. He straightened his tie, picked up his laptop bag, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the tarmac, where rain was now falling in sheets that made the runway lights blur into abstract streaks of color. For the first time, in months, maybe years, Marcus found himself completely alone with his thoughts. The constant buzz of business calls, social obligations, and Isabella's demands had created a kind of background noise that he'd grown accustomed to. But now, in the sudden silence, he could hear something he'd been ignoring, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with business stress or professional challenges. He thought about the engagement ring Isabella had left behind, sitting on the table like an expensive paperweight. The ring had cost him nearly $200,000, but he'd purchased it with the same emotional detachment he'd used to buy office furniture or company equipment. There had been no romantic proposal, no heartfelt declaration of love, just a calculated decision that marriage to Isabella would enhance his public image and provide the kind of social stability that other successful men seemed to possess. Now, as he watched the storm rage outside, Marcus wondered if he'd been chasing the wrong kind of success entirely. His net worth exceeded most small countries' GDP, his business empire spanned multiple industries, and his name appeared regularly on lists of the world's most influential people. Yet standing in this airport lounge, surrounded by luxury he barely noticed anymore, he felt more isolated than he had as a struggling entrepreneur working 18-hour days in a cramped garage office. The lounge gradually emptied as other passengers made arrangements for overnight accommodations or alternative travel plans. Marcus remained by the window, declining offers from the staff to help arrange hotel reservations or transportation back to the city. He had nowhere urgent to be for the first time in recent memory. No crisis demanding his immediate attention, no meeting that couldn't be postponed or conducted via video conference. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, his business, partners, and various contacts who'd somehow already heard about his public breakup with Isabella. The entertainment blogs worked quickly, apparently, and by morning his personal life would likely be tabloid fodder once again. He'd grown thick-skinned about such coverage over the years, but tonight it felt different somehow, more invasive and pointless than usual. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself making an unexpected decision. Instead of returning to his Manhattan penthouse or checking into one of the airport's luxury hotels, he would spend the night in the terminal. The idea seemed absurd, even to him, a billionaire choosing to sleep in an airport when he could afford to buy the entire facility. But there was something appealing about the anonymity and simplicity of it. He gathered his belongings and ventured out of the executive lounge into the main terminal, where the atmosphere was entirely different. The commercial gates were crowded with stranded passengers dealing with their own weather-related delays and cancellations. Families with small children were camped out near charging stations. Business travelers were sprawled across uncomfortable seating areas with their laptops, and airline employees were working overtime to manage the chaos of rebooking hundreds of disrupted flights. Marcus found himself observing this different world with the fascination of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. He'd spent so many years insulated from the ordinary frustrations and inconveniences that most people dealt with regularly that the scene before him felt almost exotic. Children were crying, parents were stressed, elderly passengers were struggling with heavy luggage, and everyone seemed to be having animated conversations with airline representatives or family members about their disrupted plans. He walked through the terminal slowly, his expensive luggage rolling smoothly behind him on wheels that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. The contrast between his appearance and that of the other stranded passengers was stark. His tailored suit stood out among the casual travel clothes, yoga pants, and comfortable sneakers that seemed to be the uniform of commercial aviation. Near Gate 47, Marcus discovered a relatively quiet seating area where several passengers had already settled in for what appeared to be an extended stay. The seats were typically uncomfortable airport furniture, but they were clean and positioned near electrical outlets for charging devices. Most importantly, the area was far enough from the main thoroughfares to avoid the constant foot traffic and noise that echoed through other parts of the terminal. As Marcus settled into a seat and pulled out his laptop, he became aware of the conversations happening around him. Unlike the executive lounge, where business discussions and status updates dominated, the conversations here were more personal and immediate. A woman was trying to calm her toddler while simultaneously rebooking their flight to visit sick grandparents. A college student was calling his parents to explain why he'd miss his sister's graduation ceremony. An elderly couple was debating whether to pay the additional fees for a hotel room or try to sleep in the terminal. These weren't abstract business problems that could be solved with the right strategy or sufficient capital investment. These were human problems, personal crises that affected real people's lives in ways that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports or stock valuations. Marcus found himself listening to these conversations with an attention that surprised. him drawn into the genuine emotion and concern that characterized these strangers' interactions. Around midnight, as the terminal grew quieter and many of the shops and restaurants closed for the evening, Marcus noticed a young woman sitting several seats away from him. She was holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old, gently rocking back and forth in a rhythm that suggested this was a familiar routine. The baby was fussy, making small crying sounds that the woman was trying to soothe with whispered words and gentle pats on the back. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't just the scene itself. He'd observed plenty of parents dealing with cranky children during his travels, but something about the woman that seemed familiar. Even in the dim lighting of the terminal's nighttime ambiance, there was something about her profile, the way she held herself, that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. She was wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days, a faded sweater that looked like it had been washed too many times, jeans with a small tear near the knee that had been carefully mended, and sneakers that were clean but obviously old. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a diaper bag that was functional rather than fashionable, the kind of practical purchase that prioritized utility over style. The baby's crying intensified, and Marcus watched as the woman checked her phone with the worried expression of someone hoping for good news that wasn't coming. She fumbled through the diaper bag, pulling out a bottle and testing its temperature against her wrist, a gesture that spoke to the kind of maternal instincts that Marcus had never personally witnessed in the polished, career-focused women who typically moved in his social circles. As she lifted the bottle to feed the baby, the woman turned slightly in her seat, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The face that had seemed vaguely familiar moments before was now unmistakably clear, despite the changes that 3 years and obvious hardship had wrought. The high cheekbones were sharper now, suggesting weight loss that spoke more to financial stress than dietary choice. The green eyes that had once sparkled with laughter and optimism now carried a weariness that made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It was Sarah Chen, his college girlfriend, the woman he'd planned to marry before his business ambitions had consumed every other priority in his life. Sarah, who had supported him through the early days of building his company, who had believed in his vision when venture capitalists were still showing him the door, who had stood by him through the 18-hour days and 7-day work weeks that had been necessary to establish Blackwood Industries as a serious competitor in the tech space. Marcus felt his hands trembling slightly as memories flooded back with startling clarity. Sarah studying for her nursing degree while simultaneously helping him prepare investor presentations. Sarah celebrating with takeout Chinese food when they'd landed their first major client. Sarah falling asleep on the couch of their tiny apartment while waiting for him to come home from yet another late-night strategy session with his business partners. The last time he'd seen Sarah was 3 years ago, when she'd returned the key to his penthouse apartment and told him she couldn't compete with his company for his attention anymore. She'd been crying, he remembered now, standing in his marble foyer in her scrubs after finishing a 12-hour shift at the hospital, trying to explain why she couldn't continue a relationship where she felt like she was dating a stranger who happened to share her boyfriend's name and face. "I love you, Marcus," she'd said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and heartbreak. "But I can't love someone who isn't there anymore. Your body might be in the same room as me, but your mind, your heart, your attention, it's all somewhere else. It's been somewhere else for months now." He'd been in the middle of preparing for a crucial board meeting, his laptop open on the kitchen counter, his phone buzzing with messages from his attorney about a potential acquisition. Even as Sarah was ending their 5-year relationship, part of his attention had been on the spreadsheet showing projected quarterly earnings. He'd barely looked up when she'd placed the key on the hall table and walked out of his life forever. Now sitting in this airport terminal at past midnight, watching Sarah struggle to comfort a crying baby while clearly dealing with her own stress and exhaustion, Marcus felt the full weight of what he'd lost crashing down on him like a physical blow. This wasn't the theoretical regret he'd occasionally experienced during quiet moments in his penthouse. This was sharp, immediate, and overwhelmingly real. The baby in Sarah's arms was beautiful, with thick, dark hair and features that seemed to combine Asian and possibly Latino heritage. As Sarah adjusted the baby's position to better support the feeding, Marcus found himself wondering about the child's father, about the life Sarah had built in the 3 years since their relationship ended, about the circumstances that had led to her sitting in an airport terminal at midnight, looking like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Sarah's phone rang, and she answered it with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she was managing multiple crises simultaneously. "Hello, Mrs. Rodriguez," she said quietly, mindful of the sleeping passengers around her. "No, we're still stuck at the airport. All the flights are cancelled until tomorrow morning." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the call. "I understand you need to leave for your daughter's wedding, but I can't get back until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. I'm so sorry." Marcus could hear the frustration and desperation in Sarah's voice as she continued the conversation. Apparently, Mrs. Rodriguez was the babysitter who was supposed to watch Sarah's baby while she worked her nursing shifts, and the wedding was a family emergency that couldn't be postponed. The cancellation meant Sarah would miss at least 2 shifts at the hospital, which translated to lost income she clearly couldn't afford. "No, please don't worry about it," Sarah was saying, though her voice suggested she was anything but unconcerned. "These things happen. I'll figure something out. I hope your daughter has a beautiful wedding." She ended the call and immediately began scrolling through her contacts, presumably looking for alternative childcare arrangements or trying to explain her situation to her supervisors at the hospital. Marcus watched as Sarah made call after call, each conversation ending with the same result: sympathy but no practical solutions. The overnight childcare options she could afford were already booked. The hospital couldn't excuse her absence without significant consequences to her employment, and her family members who might normally help were either too far away or dealing with their own obligations. As the baby finished eating and Sarah began the process of burping and settling him for sleep, Marcus found himself standing up before he'd consciously decided to approach her. His feet carried him across the seating area while his mind raced through a dozen different opening lines, none of which seemed adequate for the complexity of their history and current situation. "Sarah," he said softly, stopping a respectful distance away from where she was sitting. His voice was barely above a whisper, mindful of the sleeping baby and the other passengers who had finally managed to find some rest in the uncomfortable terminal seating. She looked up at him with the kind of startled recognition that suggested she'd been as unaware of his presence as he'd initially been of hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The 3 years of separation condensed into a single moment of awkward silence that stretched between them like a chasm. "Marcus?" she replied finally, her voice carefully neutral despite the obvious surprise. In her eyes, "I didn't expect to see you here." She glanced around the decidedly unglamorous surroundings, taking in the tired passengers, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the general atmosphere of frustrated transit that characterized their current environment. "This doesn't seem like your usual travel experience." Her tone wasn't accusatory or bitter, but there was a subtle acknowledgement of the vast difference between their current circumstances and the lifestyle she'd observed during their relationship. Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment about the private jet, the executive lounge, and all the other privileges that had insulated him from the kind of situation Sarah was currently navigating. "Flight got cancelled," he said, immediately realizing how inadequate the explanation sounded. Weather delay turned into an overnight cancellation. He gestured vaguely toward the windows, where rain was still streaking down the glass in sheets that made the outside world look like an impressionist painting. Sarah nodded, still gently rocking the baby, who was finally beginning to settle into sleep. Same here. We were supposed to fly back to Chicago this morning, but that didn't happen. And now... She trailed off, and Marcus could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from dealing with problems that had no easy solutions. Chicago? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the life she'd built since leaving New York. You moved to Chicago? 2 years ago, Sarah replied, adjusting the baby's blanket with the practiced movements of someone who'd done this countless times. I got a position at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, better opportunity for advancement, and the cost of living is more manageable than New York. She paused, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped just enough for Marcus to see the stress she was carrying, or it was more manageable anyway. The implication in her words was clear. Whatever financial stability she'd achieved in Chicago was currently under strain. Marcus wanted to ask more questions, to understand what had happened in her life that had led to this moment, but he also sensed that pushing too hard too quickly would cause her to withdraw entirely. Instead, he found himself asking, "Is there anything I can do to help?" The question seemed to surprise them both. Sarah looked at him with the kind of careful evaluation that suggested she was trying to determine whether his offer was genuine or simply the kind of polite gesture that wealthy people made without expecting to follow through. Marcus, meanwhile, realized that his offer had been completely spontaneous, driven by some instinct he hadn't even known he possessed. I don't think there's anything anyone can do at this point, Sarah said after a long pause. It's just one of those situations where everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, and now I have to figure out how to deal with the consequences. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, and Marcus saw a flash of fierce protectiveness cross her face. We'll manage, we always do. The simple statement carried so much weight that Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Sarah wasn't asking for pity or making excuses. She was simply stating a fact about her resilience and determination that reminded him of the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. The woman who had supported his dreams, even when it meant sacrificing her own comfort. Who had believed in his potential, even when he'd barely believed in it himself. Sarah, he began, then stopped, unsure how to bridge the gap between them, or whether she would even want him to try. I know we haven't spoken in years, and I know I don't have any right to ask about your life, but... He gestured toward the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully against Sarah's shoulder. He's beautiful. What's his name? Sarah's expression softened slightly as she looked down at her son. Daniel, she said quietly. Danny, he's 5 months old. She paused, and Marcus thought he saw something shift in her eyes, some internal calculation that he couldn't quite read. He's been the best thing to happen to me in a very long time. Marcus felt his throat tighten at the love and devotion in Sarah's voice when she spoke about her son. It was the same tone she'd once used when talking about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. The same warmth that had drawn him to her in the first place before his ambitions had slowly eroded their connection. Now, seeing her with Danny, he was struck by how much he'd missed during the years they'd been apart, how much life had continued without him. He looks like he has your determination, Marcus said, surprised by how natural it felt to be talking to her despite the years of separation and the awkwardness of their current situation. Even sleeping, he looks like he knows exactly what he wants. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her since recognizing her across the terminal. He definitely knows what he wants, and he's not shy about letting everyone know when he's not getting it. He's been incredibly patient. Tonight, considering we've been traveling for almost 14 hours now. 14 hours, Marcus asked, his business mind immediately calculating the logistics of such an extended travel day with an infant. Where were you coming from? Los Angeles, Sarah replied, shifting Danny to a more comfortable position as she prepared to settle in for what was clearly going to be a long night. I had a job interview at Children's Hospital. It's a specialist position that could really advance my career, but it meant bringing Danny with me since I couldn't afford both a plane ticket and childcare for 3 days. Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been guilt as he processed this information. While he'd been jet-setting between cities in private aircraft, complaining about minor inconveniences and luxury that didn't quite meet his elevated standards, Sarah had been managing cross-country travel with an infant, while pursuing career opportunities that could improve their lives. The contrast felt stark and somehow shameful. "How did the interview go?" he asked, genuinely curious about her professional life and what kind of position would require such dedication to pursue. "Really well, actually," Sarah said, and for a moment her face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm Marcus remembered from their college days when she'd talk about her dreams of working in pediatric medicine. "It's a position in their neonatal intensive care unit. They're looking for someone with experience in high-risk infant care, and I've been specializing in that area for the past 2 years. The salary would be..." She paused, glancing around as if suddenly remembering where they were and who she was talking to. "It would be a significant improvement over my current situation." Marcus nodded, understanding her hesitation to discuss financial details. The awkwardness of their vastly different economic circumstances hung between them like an uncomfortable reminder of how their lives had diverged. While Sarah was pursuing job opportunities that might represent a meaningful salary increase for her, Marcus routinely made business decisions involving amounts that would represent decades of her nursing income. "That's fantastic," he said, and he genuinely meant it. "I remember how passionate you were about working with children. It sounds like you've built exactly the kind of career you always talked about wanting." "I've tried," Sarah replied quietly. "It hasn't always been easy, especially since Danny was born. But nursing has always been more than just a job for me. These kids need advocates, people who will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves." She looked down at her sleeping son and smiled. "Danny's taught me even more about that. Being responsible for someone so completely dependent changes your perspective on everything." Marcus felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify as he watched Sarah's face transform when she talked about her son and her work. There was a depth of purpose and meaning in her voice that he realized had been missing from his own life for years. His business success had brought him wealth, recognition, and influence, but listening to Sarah talk about her calling as a nurse made him question whether he'd been pursuing the right kind of achievement. "Sarah," he said impulsively, "can I ask you something personal?" She tensed slightly, her protective instincts clearly activated by the shift in his tone. "That depends on the question." Marcus hesitated, suddenly uncertain about whether he had the right to satisfy his curiosity about her personal life. But the question had been building inside him since the moment he'd recognized her, and he found himself asking it despite his better judgment. "Danny's father," he began carefully, Are you two still together?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Marcus immediately regretted asking it. Sarah's expression closed off, her body language shifting to something more guarded and defensive. She looked away from him, focusing her attention on adjusting Danny's blanket, even though it didn't need adjusting. "That's complicated," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested she didn't want to elaborate. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized how inappropriate his question had been. Whatever Sarah's relationship status, it was none of his business, especially given their history and the circumstances of their current encounter. He'd been operating on some misguided impulse to understand her life, but he had no right to demand explanations about her personal choices. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That was out of line. Your personal life is none of my business." Sarah looked at him then, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed and uncomfortable. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not your business, but since you asked..." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Danny's father isn't in the picture, it's just the two of us." The simple statement carried implications that Marcus found himself analyzing despite his attempt to respect her boundaries. Sarah was raising Danny as a single mother while pursuing a demanding career in nursing, managing cross-country travel for job interviews, and dealing with the kind of financial pressures that made overnight childcare arrangements a significant concern. The woman who had once shared his dreams and supported his ambitions was now facing challenges that his wealth could solve with a single phone call, yet she was handling them with the same quiet strength that had first attracted him to her years ago. "That must be incredibly difficult," Marcus said, and he meant it. "Raising a child alone while building your career. I can't imagine how you manage it all." Sarah shrugged, a gesture that seemed designed to minimize the challenges she was facing. "You do what you have to do. Danny didn't ask to be born, and he deserves the best life I can give him. That means making sacrifices, working harder, and sometimes sleeping in airport terminals when flights get cancelled." She managed a small smile at the last part, acknowledging their shared predicament with a touch of humor that reminded Marcus of the woman he'd once known. The terminal around them had grown quieter as the night progressed, with most of the stranded passengers settling into whatever sleep they could manage in the uncomfortable seating. The cleaning crews were making their rounds, and the few remaining open concessions were preparing to close for the night. Marcus realized that he and Sarah had been talking for over an hour, their conversation flowing with an ease that surprised him, given the years of separation and the dramatic differences in their current circumstances. "Marcus," Sarah said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "Can I ask you something now?" He nodded, bracing himself for whatever question she might have about his life, his business, or the obvious wealth that separated their current situations. "What are you really doing here?" she asked. "I mean, I saw you earlier with that woman. She was beautiful, and you both looked like you belonged in first class, not sleeping in a terminal with the rest of us regular people. What happened?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he remembered his confrontation with Isabella and the public spectacle of their breakup. The memory felt both recent and distant, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. The concerns that had seemed so important just hours ago, his public image, the engagement ring, Isabella's career demands, now felt trivial and superficial compared to the real challenges Sarah was facing. "That was Isabella," he said finally. "My ex-fiancée, as of about 6 hours ago. We had a disagreement about priorities, and she decided she'd rather be anywhere else than stuck in an airport with me." He paused, surprised by how little emotion the memory stirred. Turns out she was probably right about that. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression mixing surprise with something that might have been sympathy. "You were engaged?" "For about 3 months, Marcus replied, realizing as he said it how brief and meaningless the engagement had been. "It was more of a business arrangement than a romantic relationship, if I'm being honest. We looked good together at charity events and board meetings. Our relationship photographed well for the society pages. That sounds... Sarah began, then stopped herself, clearly thinking better of whatever observation she'd been about to make. Shallow, Marcus supplied. Calculated? Emotionally bankrupt? He let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, it was all of those things. The whole engagement was probably the most expensive mistake I've ever made, and that's saying something, considering some of the business deals I've walked away from. Sarah studied his face in the dim terminal lighting, her expression unreadable. You don't seem particularly upset about it ending. Marcus considered her observation, surprised to realize she was absolutely right. The end of his engagement to Isabella should have felt like a significant loss, a disruption to his carefully planned life trajectory. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale. I'm not, he admitted. I think I've been going through the motions for so long that I forgot what it felt like to actually care about something beyond quarterly earnings and market positioning. He gestured around the terminal, taking in the sleeping passengers, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the general atmosphere of shared inconvenience. This is the first time in years that I've had a conversation that felt real, that wasn't about business strategy or social obligations. Sarah shifted Danny to her other arm as he stirred slightly in his sleep, her movements gentle and practiced. Real conversations require actually being present for them, she said quietly. That was always the problem between us, Marcus. Even when your body was in the room, your mind was somewhere else, solving problems that seemed more important than whatever was happening right in front of you. Her words hit him with the force of recognition. It was exactly what she'd told him 3 years ago when she'd ended their relationship. But at the time, he'd been too focused on his business concerns to truly hear what she was saying. Now, sitting in this airport terminal with nowhere urgent to be and no pressing deadlines to meet, he finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him. You were right, he said simply, about everything. I was so obsessed with building something significant that I lost sight of what was already significant in my life. He paused, watching as she gently stroked Danny's hair with a tenderness that made his chest ache. I lost you because I was too stupid to recognize what I had. Sarah's expression softened, but there was still a wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there during their college years. Marcus, that was 3 years ago. We're different people now, living completely different lives. I can't go backwards, especially not with Danny to think about. I'm not asking you to go backwards, Marcus said quickly, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was asking for. Seeing you tonight, talking to you, it's made me realize how empty my life has become. I have everything I thought I wanted, but I don't have anything that actually matters. Danny stirred again, this time waking up with the kind of cranky whimper that suggested he wasn't pleased about being in an unfamiliar environment. Sarah immediately shifted into mother mode, checking his diaper, offering him a pacifier, and speaking to him in the soothing tones that seemed to calm his distress. Hey there, little man, she murmured, standing up to rock him gently. I know this isn't home, and I know you're tired, but we're going to be okay. We just need to get through tonight, and tomorrow we'll be back in our own bed. Marcus watched this intimate moment between mother and child with fascination and something that might have been envy. There was such complete devotion in Sarah's attention to Danny, such absolute prioritization of his needs over her own comfort or convenience. It was the kind of unconditional love that Marcus had spent years dismissing as weakness or distraction, but now he saw it as perhaps the most powerful force he'd ever witnessed. He's lucky to have you, Marcus said when Danny had settled back into a drowsy state. You're an incredible mother. Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if the compliment had caught her off guard. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than you might realize. Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, trying to balance everything and hoping I'm not screwing him up too badly. You're not screwing him up, Marcus said with more conviction than he'd felt about anything in months. He's calm with you, trusting. He knows he's safe. That's not something you can fake or buy. It comes from genuine love and dedication. Sarah settled back into her seat, Danny now peaceful in her arms. It's not always this serene, she said, with a tired smile. Sometimes he screams for hours, and I have no idea what he needs. Sometimes I'm so exhausted I can barely think straight, and I wonder if I'm making terrible decisions about his care. Being a single mother is... She trailed off, shaking her head. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into her honesty about the challenges she was facing. In his world, people rarely admitted to struggles or vulnerabilities. Success was performed through confidence and control, and any hint of difficulty was seen as weakness that could be exploited by competitors or critics. But Sarah's willingness to acknowledge the real difficulties of her situation while still radiating love for her son struck him as the most authentic thing he'd encountered in years. What happened with Danny's father? Marcus asked gently, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Sarah's expression close off again. I'm sorry, I don't have any right to ask that. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze focused on Danny's sleeping face. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. His father was someone I met about a year after we broke up. I thought I was ready for a new relationship, thought I'd moved on from what we had. She glanced at Marcus, her expression unreadable. I was wrong about a lot of things. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Jealousy seemed too simple, though there was certainly an element of that. More than jealousy, though, he felt a deep regret about the path that had led Sarah to seek comfort with someone else, someone who had ultimately failed her when she needed support most. He left when you told him about the pregnancy? Marcus guessed, reading between the lines of her carefully neutral tone. He suggested that having a baby would ruin both our careers and offered to pay for me to take care of the problem, Sarah said quietly, her arms tightening protectively around Danny. When I told him that wasn't an option for me, he said he couldn't be responsible for my poor decision-making. I haven't heard from him since. The casual cruelty of Danny's father's response hit Marcus like a physical blow. He found himself imagining Sarah, pregnant and alone, facing the enormous challenge of single motherhood while dealing with the betrayal of someone she'd trusted with her future. The strength it must have taken to continue her nursing career, maintain her independence, and provide for Danny while processing such abandonment was staggering. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and the words felt inadequate to express the depth of his empathy for what she'd endured. That must have been devastating. Sarah shrugged, but Marcus could see the old pain in her eyes. It was clarifying, actually. It showed me that I couldn't depend on anyone else to help me build the life I wanted for Danny and myself. Everything I achieve has to come from my own effort and determination. She looked down at her son with fierce love. It's also shown me what unconditional love actually looks like. Danny doesn't care about my career success or my financial status. He just needs me to be present, to put his needs first, to love him completely. The implicit contrast to Marcus's previous behavior wasn't lost on him. Sarah was describing exactly the kind of presence and prioritization that he'd been incapable of providing during their relationship. While he'd been chasing abstract concepts of success and achievement, she'd been trying to build something real and meaningful between them. Sarah, Marcus began, then stopped. unsure how to articulate the thoughts that were swirling through his mind. "Can I ask you something else?" She nodded cautiously, clearly still wary of his questions, but willing to continue their conversation. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd been different? If I'd been able to give you the attention and commitment you deserved?" The question felt vulnerable and risky, but Marcus found himself needing to know whether their relationship had meant as much to her as he was now realizing it had meant to him. Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he'd pushed too far, crossed some boundary that would end their fragile reconnection. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to think about that all the time," she admitted. "For months after we broke up, I kept hoping you'd call, that you'd realize what we'd lost and want to try again. I imagined scenarios where you'd show up at my apartment or the hospital, where you'd tell me that you'd figured out how to balance your ambitions with having a real relationship." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he processed her words. She had wanted him to fight for their relationship, had hoped for exactly the kind of grand gesture that his pride and obsession with business success had prevented him from making. "What changed?" he asked quietly. "Time," Sarah said simply, "and eventually meeting someone else who I thought might be different, might be able to give me the partnership I was looking for." She looked down at Danny, her expression mixing, love with sadness. Obviously, that didn't work out the way I'd hoped either. But it did give me Danny, and he's taught me that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst mistakes. Marcus absorbed this information, trying to process the complex timeline of Sarah's life since their breakup. She'd spent months hoping for his return, had eventually moved on to another relationship that had also failed, and was now raising Danny alone while building her nursing career. The resilience required to navigate such challenges while maintaining her essential kindness and optimism was humbling. "I wish I had called," Marcus said finally. "I wish I'd been brave enough to admit that I'd made a mistake, that losing you was the worst business decision I'd ever made." Sarah smiled sadly. "Business decision. Even now, Marcus, you're thinking about our relationship in corporate terms." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized what he'd said. Even in the middle of the most honest conversation he'd had in years, his mind still defaulted to business metaphors and strategic thinking. It was exactly the kind of emotional distance that had driven Sarah away in the first place. "You're right," he said. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? I can't seem to separate my feelings from my analytical mindset. Everything gets filtered through this lens of success and failure, profit and loss, strategic advantage and competitive positioning." "It doesn't have to be that way," Sarah said gently. "You used to be different, Marcus. When we first met in college, you were passionate about your ideas, but you were also passionate about life, about experiences, about the people around you. You cared about things that couldn't be quantified or optimized." Marcus tried to remember the person Sarah was describing, but it felt like looking back at a stranger. The young man who had fallen in love with her enthusiasm for nursing, who had spent hours talking about dreams and possibilities, who had seen business success as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. That person felt like a character from someone else's story. "I don't know how to get back to that," he admitted. "I've been this version of myself for so long that I'm not sure there's anything else left underneath all the strategy and ambition." "There is," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "I can see glimpses of him right now in the way you're talking to me, in how you're looking at Danny. You're not thinking about quarterly projections or market share. You're just being present in this moment." Marcus realized she was right. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing ahead to the next meeting, the next deal, the next strategic challenge. He was completely absorbed in this conversation, in observing Sarah's interactions with her son, in processing emotions. that he'd spent years suppressing or ignoring. Danny began to fuss again, and Sarah stood up to walk him around the small seating area. Marcus watched as she moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke to months of experience managing his needs while dealing with her own exhaustion and stress. She was humming softly, a lullaby that Marcus didn't recognize, but that seemed to soothe Danny's restlessness. "He's been such a good baby tonight," Sarah said as she returned to her seat. "Usually, being in an unfamiliar place makes him much more cranky. I think he's picked up on my stress about missing work tomorrow." "What will happen if you can't make it back for your shifts?" Marcus asked, concerned about the practical implications of their extended delay. Sarah's expression tightened. "I'll probably be written up for the absence, even though it's weather-related. The hospital has strict policies about reliability, and missing shifts affects patient care ratios." She paused, clearly calculating the potential consequences. "If I get written up too many times, it could affect my employment status, which would make it much harder to qualify for the position in Los Angeles." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the inflexibility of a system that would penalize someone for circumstances completely beyond their control. The idea that Sarah's career prospects could be damaged by weather delays seemed fundamentally unjust, especially when she was clearly dedicated to her patients and profession. "That's ridiculous," he said. "You're stuck here because of a storm, not because of any choice you made. How can they hold that against you?" "Because hospitals need reliable staffing to function safely," Sarah explained patiently. "They can't make exceptions for every individual circumstance, even when those circumstances are beyond our control. It's not personal, it's just the reality of working in healthcare." Marcus found himself wanting to solve this problem for her, to make phone calls or leverage his influence to ensure that her absence wouldn't affect her employment. The impulse was so strong that he had to consciously stop himself from immediately offering to intervene on her behalf. "There has to be something that can be done," he said instead. "Some way to document that this wasn't your fault, that you made every reasonable effort to return on time." Sarah looked at him with a mix of appreciation and sadness. "Marcus, I appreciate the concern, but this is my reality. I can't control the weather, and I can't control hospital policies. All I can do is deal with the consequences and keep moving forward." Her acceptance of circumstances that seemed fundamentally unfair struck Marcus as both admirable and heartbreaking. She'd learned to navigate a world where her dedication and hard work could be undermined by forces beyond her control, where single mothers in demanding professions had to accept whatever support systems were available rather than demanding better ones. "It shouldn't be this hard," Marcus said quietly. "Raising a child while building a career, managing on a single income, dealing with inflexible policies that don't account for real-life challenges. None of that should be as difficult as you're making it look." Sarah smiled, but there was exhaustion behind it. "Most things that matter are hard, Marcus. The easy path rarely leads to anything worthwhile." She adjusted Danny's position as he settled back into sleep. "Besides, Danny makes it all worth it. Every sacrifice, every challenge, every sleepless night, he's worth all of it and more." Marcus watched the tender way she looked at her son and felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of what love actually looked like when it wasn't filtered through strategic considerations or social expectations. Sarah's love for Danny was pure and uncomplicated, requiring nothing in return except the opportunity to care for him and watch him grow. "I never understood that before," Marcus said softly. "The idea of loving someone so completely that their needs become more important than your own comfort or success. I always thought that kind of thinking was weakness, that it would interfere with achieving important goals." "It's not weakness," Sarah replied firmly. "It's the opposite. Loving someone that much gives you strength you didn't know you had, makes you capable of sacrifices you never thought you could make. Danny has made me a better nurse, a more determined person, a more compassionate human being." Marcus absorbed her words, trying to imagine what it would feel like to have that kind of purpose and meaning in his life. His business success had brought him recognition and financial rewards, but it had never provided the deep satisfaction that he heard in Sarah's voice when she talked about motherhood. "Sarah," he said impulsively, "what if you didn't have to choose between your career and financial stability? What if you could focus on being the best nurse and mother possible without worrying about making ends meet?" Her expression immediately became guarded. "What do you mean?" Marcus realized he was venturing into dangerous territory, but he couldn't stop himself from exploring the possibility. "I mean, what if someone wanted to help you, to make sure that Danny had everything he needed and that you could pursue the career opportunities you deserved without worrying about the financial constraints?" Sarah's posture stiffened, and Marcus could see defensive walls going up around her. "Marcus, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, the answer is no. I don't need charity, and I don't want anyone else controlling my life or Danny's future." "It wouldn't be charity," Marcus said quickly, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was proposing, "and it wouldn't come with strings or control. Seeing you struggle with problems that money could solve, knowing that I have resources that could make your life easier, it feels wrong not to offer." Sarah stood up abruptly, still holding Danny, her movements sharp with tension. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said quietly, mindful of the sleeping passengers around them, but clearly agitated. "This is why I never wanted to see you again, why I hoped our paths would never cross." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he realized how badly he'd misread the situation. "Sarah, wait. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," she interrupted, her voice filled with a pain that made Marcus's stomach clench. "You saw me struggling, and your first instinct was to try to fix it with money, to make the problem go away so you wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable about the inequality between us." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah continued before he could speak. "Do you have any idea how insulting that is? I've spent 3 years building a life for myself, proving that I can handle whatever challenges come my way, showing that I don't need anyone else to rescue me. And the first time you see me facing difficulties, you immediately assume I need your help to solve them." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow, because he recognized the truth in it. His offer had been motivated by discomfort with her situation rather than respect for her autonomy, by a desire to alleviate his own guilt rather than genuine understanding of what she might actually need or want. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're absolutely right. I was being condescending and presumptuous. I have no right to assume that you need or want my help." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been disappointment. "The thing is, Marcus, part of me isn't even surprised. This is who you've always been, someone who thinks every problem can be solved with the right application of resources and strategy. You've never understood that some things can't be fixed, only experienced and grown from." Marcus felt the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. She was describing a fundamental flaw in his character, a way of approaching the world that reduced complex human experiences to problems that could be optimized or eliminated. It was the same mindset that had driven his business success, but had apparently made him incapable of genuine intimacy or understanding. "I want to understand," he said desperately. "I want to be different, to see things the way you see them, but I don't know how to change patterns that have been part of me for so long." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though the wariness remained. "Change isn't something that happens because you want it to, Marcus. It happens because you're willing to do the hard work of examining your assumptions and challenging your instincts, even when it's uncomfortable." Danny stirred in her arms. making small sounds that suggested he might be waking up again. Sarah immediately refocused her attention on him, checking to see if he needed anything and speaking to him in the soothing tones that seemed to be second nature for her. Marcus watched this interaction and felt something click into place in his understanding. Sarah's attention to Danny wasn't strategic or calculated, it was instinctive and immediate. When her son needed something, everything else became secondary, not because she'd analyzed the situation and determined the optimal response, but because his needs simply mattered more to her than her own comfort. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Marcus said quietly. "It's not about solving problems or optimizing outcomes. It's about being present for what matters, even when what matters is difficult or inconvenient." Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to grasp the concept so quickly. "That's part of it," she agreed cautiously, "but understanding intellectually and actually living that way are very different things." "Then teach me," Marcus said, the words coming out before he'd consciously decided to say them. "Show me what." "It looks like to prioritize what actually matters." Sarah stared at him in astonishment. "Marcus, I can't teach you how to be a different person. That's work you have to do yourself." "I know," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. He did know, but maybe I could start by helping you with Danny tonight. Not fixing your problems or throwing money at your difficulties, but just being present, being useful in whatever small ways you'll let me. Sarah's expression cycled through skepticism, consideration, and something that might have been cautious, hope. Danny was becoming more restless, and Marcus could see the exhaustion in her face as she prepared for another round of soothing and care that would probably last through the night. "I don't need help," she said finally, but her tone suggested she was testing him rather than definitively rejecting his offer. "I know you don't need help," Marcus replied carefully. "You've made it clear that you're perfectly capable of managing on your own. But that doesn't mean you have to manage on your own if you don't want to." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, rocking Danny gently as she seemed to weigh her options. When she finally spoke, her voice was cautious, but not entirely closed off. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus realized he didn't have a clear answer to her question. His offer had been spontaneous, driven by an impulse to connect with her and Danny rather than any specific plan or agenda. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I could hold him while you tried to get some sleep, or get you coffee, or just be here, so you're not handling everything alone." "You don't know anything about babies," Sarah pointed out, though her tone was more practical than dismissive. "No," Marcus agreed. "I don't, but I could learn if you're willing to teach me." Sarah looked down at Danny, who was now fully awake and beginning to fuss with the kind of escalating distress that suggested a long night ahead. Marcus could see her calculating the pros and cons of accepting his help, weighing her instinctive self-reliance against the practical benefits of having support during what was clearly going to be a challenging situation. "If I let you help," she said slowly, "it's not because I can't handle this myself. It's because—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because maybe it's time I stopped proving to the world that I don't need anyone." Marcus felt something warm and unexpected bloom in his chest at her words. "And maybe it's time I learned what it means to be needed for something that actually matters." Sarah studied his face in the dim terminal lighting, and Marcus had the sense that she was seeing something in him that even he wasn't sure existed, yet. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said quietly, "you can help, but we do this my way, at my pace, and if Danny gets upset with you, you back off immediately." "Understood," Marcus said, and he meant it completely. Sarah carefully transferred Danny into Marcus's arms, her hands guiding his positioning until the baby was secure against his chest. Marcus had held expensive artifacts worth millions of dollars with less nervousness than he felt cradling this tiny human being who seemed impossibly fragile and precious. "Support his head like this," Sarah instructed softly, adjusting Marcus's arm, "and keep him close to your body so he feels secure. Babies can sense tension, so try to relax." Danny looked up at Marcus with wide, curious eyes that seemed to be evaluating this new person holding him. For a moment, Marcus forgot about everything else, the cancelled flights, his broken engagement, his billion-dollar empire, and simply marveled at the trust this infant was placing in him. "He's so light," Marcus whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow damage this perfect little being. "He's actually gained 2 pounds since birth," Sarah said, settling back into her seat with visible relief. "The doctors were worried about his weight initially, but he's been thriving." She watched Marcus hold her son with an expression that mixed surprise with something warmer. "You're doing fine. See how calm he is." Marcus looked down at Danny, who had indeed settled peacefully in his arms. The baby's breathing was steady and even, his tiny fingers curled against Marcus's shirt. Something profound shifted in Marcus's chest as he realized this might be the first time in years that another living being had trusted him completely, without calculation or agenda. Over the next several hours, as the terminal grew quieter and the storm continued raging outside, Marcus found himself learning lessons he'd never expected to need. Sarah taught him how to recognize Danny's different cries, hunger versus tiredness versus the need for a diaper change. She showed him how to burp the baby properly, how to rock him in a rhythm that would soothe rather than overstimulate, how to simply be present without trying to fix or optimize the experience. "The thing about babies," Sarah explained as she prepared another bottle, "is that they force you to live in the moment. Danny doesn't care about my career goals or financial stress. He needs what he needs right now, and everything else has to wait." Marcus absorbed this wisdom while gently bouncing Danny, who had become fussy again despite his earlier contentment. The simple act of comforting another human being without any expectation of return or strategic advantage felt foreign, but somehow essential, like learning to use a sense he'd never known he possessed. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant earlier," Marcus said quietly, "about some things not being problems to solve, just experiences to live through." Sarah smiled as she tested the bottle temperature. "It took me months to really accept that with Danny. I kept trying to establish schedules and routines to make his needs more predictable and manageable. But babies don't work that way. They're just completely, authentically themselves." As dawn approached, painting the terminal windows with pale grey light, Marcus realized he'd spent the entire night focused on something other than business for the first time in years. His phone had buzzed occasionally with messages from his assistant and business partners, but he'd ignored them completely, his attention absorbed by the immediate needs of Sarah and Danny. "The storms are finally clearing," Sarah observed, looking out at the gradually brightening sky. "We should be able to fly out this morning." Marcus felt an unexpected pang of loss at the thought of returning to their separate lives. The night had felt suspended outside of normal time, a bubble of intimacy and purpose that would burst the moment they boarded their respective flights. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I know you said you don't want my help, but what if I told you that helping you and Danny last night was the most meaningful thing I've done in years?" She looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything I've achieved in business, all the money and recognition and power, none of it has ever felt as important as making sure Danny was comfortable or helping you get a few hours of rest." Marcus shifted the sleeping baby to a more secure position. "You've shown me what it means to care about something beyond my own success." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Marcus, that's beautiful, and I'm glad this experience has been meaningful for you. But you can't build a life around one night of clarity. Real change takes time and consistency." "I know," Marcus replied. "But what if this isn't just one night? What if it's the beginning of something different?" Before Sarah could respond, the airport speakers crackled to life with announcements about resumed flight operations. Around them, other stranded passengers began stirring, checking their phones for updated departure times and gathering their belongings. Sarah's flight to Chicago was scheduled to depart in 3 hours, while Marcus's rescheduled private jet wouldn't be ready until late afternoon. They would be going their separate ways soon, returning to lives that had diverged dramatically over the past 3 years. "I got the job in Los Angeles," Sarah said suddenly. "I found out yesterday before our flight got cancelled. That's part of why missing my shifts in Chicago is so complicated. I need to give proper notice." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions at this news: pride in her achievement, concern about the challenges of relocating with an infant, and something selfish that he didn't want to examine too closely. "That's incredible," he said sincerely. "You deserve that opportunity. Danny's lucky to have a mother who fights so hard for both of your futures." "Thank you," Sarah replied, though her expression suggested the decision wasn't entirely simple. "It's a big change, starting over in a new city with Danny, but the salary increase will make everything easier, and the professional opportunities are amazing." Marcus found himself wanting to make another offer of help to smooth her transition somehow, but he caught himself before the words could escape. Sarah had made it clear that she valued her independence above financial assistance, and he was finally beginning to understand that respecting her autonomy was more important than solving her problems. Instead, he said, "If you ever want to talk about work or Danny or anything else, I'd like that. Not as someone trying to fix your life, but as someone who cares about how you're doing." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "You're really serious about this, aren't you? About wanting to be different?" "More serious than I've ever been about anything," Marcus replied without hesitation. Sarah reached into her diaper bag and pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before extending it toward him. "Put your number in there, but Marcus, I need you to understand something. If you do this, if you ask to be part of our lives in any way, you can't disappear when it gets difficult or inconvenient. Danny doesn't understand adult complications, and I won't let him get attached to someone who might leave." Marcus took her phone with hands that trembled slightly. "I understand. And Sarah, I want you to know that if I ever let you down, if I fall back into old patterns and put my business ahead of what matters, I want you to call me on it. Don't just walk away, make me face what I'm doing wrong. That's a lot of responsibility to put on someone," Sarah said quietly. "It's the kind of responsibility that might actually make me a better person," Marcus replied, carefully entering his contact information. As passengers began lining up for the first departing flights, Sarah started packing Danny's supplies with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing everything alone. Marcus found himself reluctant to let go of the baby, who had spent the last hour sleeping peacefully in his arms. "He likes you," Sarah observed, noticing Marcus's hesitation. "That's not always the case with strangers. Danny's usually more cautious." Marcus looked down at the sleeping infant, feeling something fierce and protective stir in his chest. "I like him too, more than I expected to be capable of liking anyone." Sarah's expression softened. "Children have a way of showing us parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. Good parts, usually." As they prepared to part ways, Marcus realized that the man who had entered this terminal 18 hours ago no longer existed. That man had been engaged to someone he didn't love, pursuing success that felt increasingly hollow and completely disconnected from anything that generated genuine meaning or purpose. This version of himself felt raw and uncertain, but somehow more real than he'd been in years. "Sarah," he said as she gathered the last of Danny's things, "thank you for letting me help, for trusting me with Danny, for showing me what actually matters. I know I don't deserve the chance you've given me, but I promise I won't waste it." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then surprised him by reaching up to touch his face gently. "The Marcus I fell in love with in college is still in there somewhere. Maybe this is your chance to find him again." With that, she took Danny from his arms and headed toward her gate, leaving Marcus standing alone in the terminal that had become the site of his unexpected transformation. He watched her walk away, noting the strength in her posture despite her exhaustion, the careful way she held Danny, the quiet dignity with which she handled challenges that would have overwhelmed most people. 3 months later, Marcus was sitting in his redesigned office. He'd removed half the imposing furniture and added comfortable seating near the windows, when his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It was a photo of Danny in his new nursery in Los Angeles, surrounded by toys that Marcus had sent for his 6-month birthday. "He loves the books you chose," the message read, "and the job is everything I hoped it would be. Thank you for understanding why I needed to do this on my own." Marcus smiled as he typed his response. "You're going to be an amazing pediatric nurse. Danny's lucky to have such a strong mother. How are you settling in?" Over the following weeks, their text exchanges became a regular part of Marcus's routine. Sarah would send photos of Danny's milestones, his first attempts at sitting up, his fascination with his own reflection, his delighted reactions to new foods. Marcus found himself looking forward to these glimpses into their life with an anticipation that surprised him. More importantly, he found himself applying the lessons Sarah had taught him that night in the airport to other areas of his life. He started arriving at business meetings without his phone, giving his full attention to the people in the room. He restructured his schedule to include regular breaks for reflection rather than cramming every moment with productivity. He began asking his employees about their families and personal goals, discovering that they were complex human beings rather than simply resources to be optimized. The changes weren't always easy. Marcus's assistant was initially confused by his new communication style, and some business partners questioned his decreased availability for after-hours negotiations. But the results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction increased, client relationships deepened, and Marcus found that his decision-making improved when it wasn't driven by constant urgency and stress. 6 months after their airport encounter, Sarah called him instead of texting. Her voice sounded different, lighter somehow, more confident than it had during their difficult night in the terminal. "Marcus," she said, "I wanted to tell you something. Danny said his first word yesterday." Marcus felt his heart skip. "What did he say?" Sarah laughed, and the sound was like music. "Mama, obviously, but right after that, he kept saying, 'Mama,' and looking at your picture on my refrigerator. I think he remembers you." Marcus had to clear his throat before he could respond. "I've been thinking about visiting Los Angeles for business. Would you and Danny like to have dinner? Somewhere child-friendly, obviously." "I'd like that," Sarah said softly. "We'd both like that very much." As they made plans for his visit, Marcus realized that the life he was building now bore no resemblance to the one he'd been living a year ago. His relationship with Isabella felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely. His obsession with business dominance had evolved into a more sustainable approach to success that left room for relationships and personal growth. Most importantly, he'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased or achieved through strategic planning. They could only be earned through presence, consistency, and the willingness to prioritize other people's needs above his own comfort. Standing in his office, looking out at the city he'd once thought he needed to conquer, Marcus understood that his real journey was just beginning. For the first time in his adult life, he was building something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock valuations. He was building connections that mattered, becoming a person worthy of the trust that Sarah and Danny had shown him in an airport terminal during the longest, most transformative night of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.